What happens when a woman who has built her life on invisibility is suddenly asked to step into the brightest light? Claire Bennett was 34, a quiet secretary in Boston who knew how to keep the trains running for everyone but herself. After a painful divorce, she learned to trust competence more than promises, and she lived each day behind steady routines. She never imagined her name would be whispered in headlines or spoken by the CEO she'd only ever watched from afar. But one request changed everything. Richard Hale, a powerful hotel magnate, asked her to pose as his girlfriend at a glittering charity gala. What began as a strategy to silence rumors soon unraveled into something far more dangerous: the possibility of real love. Can a relationship born under pretense survive the glare of scandal? Can two guarded hearts risk trust when the world is watching and judging? And in a city where appearances rule, will Claire's quiet honesty be strong enough to outlast doubt? Stay with us as we unfold. The secretary agreed to play the CEO girlfriend at a party, and he unexpectedly fell in love. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Ordinary mornings can hide the turning of a life. Claire Bennett had lived long enough to know that change rarely announced itself with fanfare. It often slipped in quietly, disguised as another Tuesday. She rose before the sun, the soft hum of her alarm breaking through a dream she could no longer recall. Her apartment was small, tucked into a South End building with creaky stairs and a stubborn radiator. The furnishings were a mix of second-hand pieces collected over the years. A bookshelf bowed slightly in the middle, a kitchen table scarred from past tenants, a sofa that sagged just enough to make her favor the left cushion. Yet the space was hers, and that mattered. Her mornings followed a steady rhythm. A mug of coffee brewed in a machine older than she cared to admit. A glance through the frosted window at neighbors rushing toward their own lives. A quick scan of headlines she rarely had time to finish reading. She tied her dark hair back, dressed in muted tones, and slipped on shoes practical enough for subway stairs, but polished enough for the corporate lobby. The tea carried her toward Back Bay, where glass towers caught the early light. She held her paper coffee cup like armor, savoring its warmth against the crisp September air. Boston in the fall was a contradiction, leaves aflame with color, streets buzzing with students, yet a coolness in the wind that hinted at endings. Claire's work at Hale Hospitality Group began before most executives had even parked their cars. She was the executive secretary, the person who kept the quiet machinery of the company moving. Schedules aligned because she made them align. Meetings flowed because she had anticipated the missing papers or the forgotten detail. She was the invisible seam that held things together. She had been at Hale Hospitality for 6 years, long enough to know the cadence of each department, the quirks of every manager. She could read a room with one glance: who was restless, who was defensive, who was trying to hide something. It was a skill born not from ambition, but from survival. 2 years earlier, her marriage had ended with a single conversation at a kitchen table. Promises had unraveled faster than she imagined possible. Since then, she had learned to trust competence over declarations. Competence did not betray. Competence kept the bills paid, the schedules intact, the loneliness at bay. Her colleagues respected her, though few knew her beyond surface details. They admired how she remembered birthdays, how she brought order to chaos. But when the office celebrated wins, she was rarely in the photos. That invisibility was both a shield and a wound. It protected her from scrutiny, but left her wondering if anyone ever truly saw her. Most weekends, she called her mother in Vermont. They talked about weather, recipes, and her mother's garden. Claire rarely mentioned the weight she carried inside. It was easier to describe small things than to confess the ache of feeling unnecessary. This Tuesday began like so many others. The lobby of Hale Hospitality shimmered with polished marble. Guests admired framed photographs of luxury hotels the company managed across the country. Claire passed through security with a nod, rode the elevator to the 20th floor, and settled at her desk. Her workspace was neat pens aligned, folders stacked by priority. A small plant she had somehow kept alive despite the fluorescent lighting. She opened her computer, scanned the day's agenda, and adjusted 3 meetings before anyone else noticed the conflict. She typed notes for a report she was not required to prepare, but knew would be requested later. That was how she stayed ahead, quietly, invisibly. The office around her filled with the usual sounds, phones ringing, printers churning, fragments of conversation about revenue and projections. She slipped into the rhythm, almost comforted by its predictability. Predictable meant safe. Around mid-morning, as she was reviewing travel arrangements for the board chair, a voice broke her concentration. It was Martin, one of the senior aides who usually stayed glued to the executive wing. He rarely ventured to her corner. "Claire," he said, adjusting his tie as if uncertain. "Mr. Hale would like to see you." For a moment, she assumed she had misheard. She looked up from her screen, blinking. "Me, yes," Martin confirmed, "right away. He asked for you personally." Her heart gave a startled jolt. In 6 years, she had never been summoned directly by Richard Hale. She had scheduled countless meetings for him, organized his travel, ensured his presentations ran smoothly, but always from the periphery. He was the kind of leader who moved through the office like a weather system felt, not approached. She closed her laptop slowly, her fingers trembling just enough that she noticed. A dozen scenarios flashed through her mind. Had she overlooked something critical? Had a mistake slipped past her usually meticulous checks? The walk toward the top floor felt longer than it was. Her heels tapped softly against polished floors, each step echoing in her chest. Colleagues glanced up, some with curiosity, some with sympathy, as if she were heading to judgment. The elevator ride was silent, save for the faint hum of machinery. She adjusted her blazer, smoothed her skirt, and tried to steady her breathing. Her reflection in the mirrored panel showed a woman composed, yet the pulse in her neck betrayed her. When the doors opened, the atmosphere shifted. The executive floor was quieter, carpet muffling footsteps, air cool and perfumed with something subtle and expensive. She passed offices with heavy doors, assistants bent over screens, the hush of money and decisions. At the end of the corridor stood a door larger than the rest. Frosted glass bore the name Richard Hale, Chief Executive Officer. Claire paused, her hand hovering near the handle. She drew in a breath, the kind that had carried her through courtrooms during her divorce, through lonely nights when silence pressed too close. What could Richard Hale, a man who seemed untouchable, want with her? Her palm rested against the door. The wood was cool, solid, unyielding. Her pulse quickened, and in that suspended moment, the ordinary Tuesday morning shifted into something else entirely. Most summons from a CEO spell trouble. Claire reminded herself of this as she rested her palm on Richard Hale's door, willing her pulse to steady. She had spent 6 years keeping the wheels turning behind this company without once speaking to him directly. And now, on an ordinary Tuesday, she was about to. She knocked softly, half hoping there would be no answer. But his voice, low and firm, called, "Come in." The office was nothing like the spaces she knew. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, sunlight bouncing off steel and glass towers. The carpet hushed her steps, thick and pale, almost too soft for her practical shoes. Paintings hung with deliberate care abstracts, modern pieces she didn't recognize but felt the weight of their price. Everything gleamed in curated perfection, yet the room carried a quiet that was not warmth but power. At the far end of a mahogany desk, Richard Hale rose to greet her. He was taller than she expected, shoulders square in a suit that fit as if stitched for his frame alone. His dark hair bore a few threads of silver, neat yet not stiff. But it was his eyes that unsettled her, clear, calculating, with a weariness at the edges, like a man who carried too many days on his back. "Ms. Bennett," he said, gesturing toward a chair opposite his desk. His tone was courteous, though layered with the authority of someone unaccustomed to being refused. Claire sat, smoothing her skirt to keep her hands from trembling. "Mr. Hale," she managed. He studied her for a moment, not unkindly, but with an intensity that made her feel as if every detail of her life were suddenly visible. Then he leaned back, exhaling. I'll come straight to the point. What I'm about to ask isn't a professional duty. It's personal. Her breath caught. That was not the word she expected. There's a gala this Saturday at the Museum of Fine Arts, he continued. It's one of the most visible events of the season. Every major partner and competitor in our industry attends. I am expected to be there with someone by my side. Claire blinked, unsure whether he was speaking hypothetically or leading to a reprimand she could not yet anticipate. You need me to help prepare something for it. No, he said, his gaze steady. I need you to attend with me. As my partner, my girlfriend, for the evening. The words dropped into the room like stones into water, ripples expanding outward until they reached her in slow disbelief. She felt her cheeks grow warm, the polite smile on her lips faltering. I don't understand, she said finally. Richard clasped his hands together, resting them on the desk. A competitor of mine, Veronica Blake, has been suggesting in certain circles that I lack the capacity for genuine connection, that I'm too focused on profit and growth to sustain meaningful relationships. It's absurd, but perception can outweigh truth. At this gala, perception matters. Claire tried to absorb the scope of what he was asking. The Museum of Fine Arts, glittering with chandeliers and gowns, where she would stand beside him, not as an assistant, but as if she belonged in his world. It was unthinkable. Surely, she began carefully, you could ask someone closer to your social circle, someone used to that environment. His jaw tightened slightly. That would only feed the narrative. I don't need polish. I need authenticity. You, the last word landed with surprising weight. She shifted in her chair, caught between disbelief and a pulse of something dangerously close to flattery. Mr. Hale, I've never been to an event like that. I wouldn't know how to act, what to say. That's exactly why you're the right choice, he replied. For the first time, his voice softened. You won't pretend. You'll be yourself, and that will be more disarming than any practice performance. Her mind spun with the logistics, the dress she didn't own, the shoes that would blister her feet, the stares of people who measured worth in wealth and breeding. She thought of her small apartment, her second-hand sofa, her evenings spent alone with library books. She did not belong in that world, yet part of her longed to step inside it, if only once. Sensing her hesitation, Richard added, Let me be clear. This request has no bearing on your position here. Your job remains unchanged regardless of your answer. This is not about work. This is about trust, and I trust you. The word struck deeper than he likely intended. Trust. Her marriage had dissolved because of broken trust. Her days since had been about rebuilding on competence, not hope. And here was a man, powerful and exacting, saying he trusted her. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of the city beyond the windows. She studied the lines around his eyes, the faint weariness behind his composure. This was not merely strategy. There was vulnerability here, carefully hidden, yet real, finally. She spoke, her voice low. I'll need some time to think. Of course, he said. Take the day. I'll need your answer by tomorrow morning. If you decline, I'll make other arrangements. He slid a small card across the desk. It bore the gala's date, time, and location in elegant script. Claire took it carefully, as though it might burn her fingers. When she rose to leave, Richard offered a polite nod. No pressure, no hint of disappointment. Only that steady gaze that seemed to see more than she wished revealed. The walk back to her desk felt unreal. The ordinary sounds of ringing phones and clicking keyboards now distant. She lowered herself into her chair, staring at the card in her hand. The letters shimmered faintly in the morning light, as though daring her. Her pulse was still racing. The safe routine she had built so carefully felt suddenly fragile, as if one gust of wind could topple it. Claire pressed the card flat against her desk, exhaled slowly, and wondered how a simple Tuesday had unraveled into a choice that could alter everything she knew of herself. Some choices don't look large until you try to sleep after them. Saying yes can be the quietest leap a heart ever makes. That night, Claire lay awake in her South End apartment, staring at the faint streetlight glow filtering through the blinds. The card from Richard Hale's desk rested on her nightstand, its elegant script catching glimmers each time headlights swept past the window. She turned from side to side, sheets tangling around her legs. Her mind was a pendulum. On one side, safety, the rhythm of familiar mornings, the life she had stitched together carefully after her divorce. On the other, pulse, curiosity, the possibility of stepping into a world she had always assumed was closed to her. Fear whispered of humiliation, of stares that would strip her bare. But a deeper voice, quieter, steadier, asked if she might discover something beyond competence, something closer to living. By dawn, clarity settled like mist, lifting over the Charles River. She would say yes, not recklessly, but carefully, with boundaries, with honesty. She was tired of hiding from her own life. At 9 sharp, she knocked on Richard Hale's door again. He looked up from a stack of papers, expression unreadable, as she stepped inside. "I'll do it," she said, before she could lose her nerve. Something softened in his face. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but a recognition as if her answer mattered more than he let on. "Thank you, Ms. Bennett." "Claire," she corrected gently, surprising herself. "If I'm going to play your partner, perhaps it should be Claire." His lips curved, almost a smile. Then Richard. The exchange was small, but it shifted something between them. A bridge forming where only distance had been. He outlined the plan with the precision of a man who lived by details. They would arrive together in a company car. She would be introduced to key donors and potential partners. A few dances, polite conversation, nothing more. They would leave together, visible as a pair. "I'll make sure you have everything you need," he added. "Dress, transportation, support." She nodded, her fingers tightening around the pen poised above her planner. He continued, "For your time and effort, I'd like to offer a bonus." He named a figure that made her throat tighten. But what steadied her wasn't the money. It was the next words. "I promise I will not let you be embarrassed. You will not be left alone in a room that doesn't welcome you." The assurance reached deeper than dollars ever could. She had spent years covering for others, smoothing paths so no one else faltered. To have someone promise to shield her, it was disarming. They moved into practicalities. She confessed her dislike of high heels. He raised a brow, then suggested, "Bring a second pair. No one will notice under a long gown." She admitted she was not good at small talk. He replied, "Directness is rarer than charm. Use it." The conversation eased into something almost natural. They were not equals. Power tilted the room unmistakably, but a rhythm emerged. Claire felt it in the way he listened, the way he considered her words rather than brushing them aside. As the details filled her planner, a realization startled her. This arrangement would not allow her to remain invisible. She was being asked to stand in light, to be noticed, perhaps even judged. For years, her competence had kept her hidden, reliable, steady, background, safe. Now she was stepping into a role that required her to be seen not as a secretary, not as an invisible seam, but as a woman beside Richard Hale. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. She closed her planner with deliberate care, pen snapping into its loop, her heart beat fast but steady. "All right," she said. "I'll prepare." Richard inclined his head, almost formal, yet his eyes held something warmer. "I appreciate your courage." Courage. The word lingered as she left his office. She had not thought of herself as courageous in a long time, perhaps never. Back at her desk, the ordinary sounds of the office pressed around her, phones ringing, printers whirring, colleagues murmuring about budgets. Yet the air felt different. The card on her nightstand had become a doorway, and she had stepped through. That evening, as she wrote notes in her planner at her kitchen table, she felt the shift again. She was no longer planning someone else's schedule. She was preparing for her own leap. She set down her pen, looked at the neat rows of writing, and exhaled. Then, with a firm nod, she closed the planner. The life she had known might not survive the weekend, but perhaps that was not a loss. Perhaps it was the beginning of a story she had long been afraid to tell. A dress can invite a woman to perform. Claire wanted something rarer to look like herself when the room turned to watch. The boutique sat tucked into a row of polished shops in Back Bay, its wide windows glowing with mannequins draped in gowns that looked like they belonged on red carpets rather than in her closet. When she stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and new silk. Racks of fabric shimmered in soft light, a rainbow of textures and promises. A stylist named Marissa greeted her with practiced warmth. "Mr. Hale asked us to prepare options," she said, her voice smooth as the satin hangers she carried. Claire nodded, trying not to flinch at the way Marissa glanced at her sensible shoes. Her no-nonsense blazer, the first gown Marissa brought, was breathtaking gold, sequined and heavy. Claire slipped into it in the dressing room and emerged feeling less like a woman and more like a costume. The sequins scratched against her skin, the neckline too daring, the hem pooling on the floor. She caught sight of herself in the mirror and almost laughed. The dress whispered of someone else's story, not hers. Price tags dangled like warnings, each one easily the cost of her month's rent. She smoothed the fabric nervously, the shame quiet but sharp. This was not her world. Marissa, unruffled, brought another emerald green, softer, but still too much. Claire's reflection looked painted, someone trying to disappear behind shine. It wasn't until she slipped into a midnight blue gown that something shifted. The fabric skimmed her shape without clinging. The neckline was modest, elegant, with just enough curve to remind her she was still a woman, not a shadow. The dress caught light in subtle ripples, understated yet undeniable. She stood in front of the mirror, breathing slowly. For the first time that afternoon, she didn't feel disguised. She felt present. Shoes came next, towering heels that made her stumble in the dressing room. Claire tried to hide her grimace as she wobbled forward, gripping the chair for balance. It was at that moment the door opened and Richard Hale stepped inside. He paused, taking in the scene. Claire, halfway bent, one heel slipping off, her face caught between dignity and disaster. For a second, his expression was unreadable, then the corners of his mouth curved upward. Claire's cheeks flushed. "I suppose elegance isn't my natural gift," she muttered, tugging off the heel. Richard's laugh was quiet but real, a sound she hadn't imagined he could make. No one's natural in those contraptions. "Bring a second pair. Comfort matters more than appearance once the cameras are gone." The words, so practical, cut through her embarrassment. He wasn't mocking her. He was paying attention. Marissa returned with accessories, delicate shawls, jewelry that sparkled under the boutique's lights. Together they settled on a silver necklace, simple enough to frame the neckline without stealing the dress's quiet strength. A shawl of soft gray wool for the September chill. Richard observed without pressing opinions. When Marissa asked if he liked a particular gown, he deferred, saying only, "It should be her choice. She's the one wearing it." The deference surprised Claire more than anything. She had expected command, perhaps even indifference. Instead, there was patience, as if he wanted her to anchor herself before stepping into his world. When the choices were finalized, Claire returned to the mirror one last time. Midnight blue, modest neckline, the silver necklace catching light. For a long moment, she stared at the woman looking back. "Better," Richard said quietly behind her. His tone held no performance, no strategy, only honesty. She turned slightly, catching his reflection beside hers. His posture, so often carved from certainty, seemed to ease. His gaze lingered on the floor-to-ceiling mirror before sliding toward the window, where Boston's skyline stretched in the distance. "You know," he said, almost as if speaking to himself, "these galas unsettle me more than board meetings ever have." Claire blinked. The admission was unscripted, bare. From a man who closed million-dollar deals without hesitation, the vulnerability was unexpected. Why, she asked softly. "Because meetings are predictable, data, contracts, strategy. I know those languages, but rooms filled with glitter and gossip, They remind me how quickly perception can twist, how easy it is to be seen and misread. His honesty carved away at the polished mask she had always assumed was permanent. In its place stood a man, not just a CEO, a man who feared appearances as much as she did. For the first time, she saw him not as untouchable, but as human. The stylist reappeared, bustling with garment bags and receipts, and the fragile moment dissolved. But it lingered in Claire's chest as she left the boutique, dress in hand. That evening, in her apartment, she hung the gown carefully on her closet door. The blue fabric shimmered against the faded walls, almost out of place in her modest room. She brushed her fingers along the fabric, tracing the seams. In the mirror across from her bed, she caught her own reflection. Tired eyes, hair pulled back, the ordinary lines of her face. Yet, beneath the ordinariness, something steadier stirred. She was not preparing to vanish behind competence. She was preparing to be seen. Claire exhaled, a slow breath that settled her shoulders. The woman staring back from the mirror was not a stranger. She was herself, stronger, steadier, ready to enter a brighter room without losing her center. Some rooms make people smaller. Some ask them to rise. Tonight, Claire would learn what it felt like to be truly seen. The black car moved smoothly through Boston's Saturday evening traffic, headlights sweeping across familiar brownstones and glittering storefronts. Claire sat beside Richard, the midnight blue gown folding gracefully over her knees. Her hands rested in her lap, but her fingers wouldn't stay still. She smoothed the shawl, adjusted her necklace, then smoothed the shawl again. "Breathe," Richard said quietly, not looking at her, but watching the passing lights. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Easier said than done. He gave the faintest smile. "That's true." When the car pulled to a stop outside the Museum of Fine Arts, Claire felt her pulse quicken. The building loomed with its columns and stone steps, banners announcing the evening's cause. Photographers waited near the entrance, their cameras flashing in bursts as couples emerged in gowns and tuxedos. The air shimmered with expectancy, as though the night itself were rehearsed theater. Richard stepped out first, straightening his jacket, and then turned to offer his hand. She placed her fingers in his, surprised by the steadiness of his grip. When she rose, the cameras flared, and for a heartbeat she wanted to shrink back into the car. But Richard's hand remained firm, guiding her up the steps. "You belong here," he murmured, his voice low enough for her alone. Inside, chandeliers spilled light across marble floors. A string quartet played softly, their notes threading through the hum of conversation. Guests moved in elegant clusters, their laughter polished, their jewelry catching the glow. Waiters glided by with trays of champagne flutes that sparkled like liquid gold. Claire inhaled deeply. She expected to feel like an intruder, but instead there was a strange calm, as if the dress, the shawl, and the steadiness of Richard's presence anchored her. Introductions began almost immediately. Richard steered her gently toward a pair of board members, Margaret Ellis and her husband, who greeted him with the warmth of old allies. "And this is Claire Bennett," Richard said, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. Claire extended her hand. "It's an honor to meet you," she said, her voice even. "I've read about your foundation's work with urban schools. The after-school program sounded especially meaningful." Margaret's eyes brightened. "You follow our work. I try to," Claire admitted. "My mother's a retired teacher. I know what those programs can mean for kids who don't get much elsewhere." The woman's smile softened, warmer now, as if a door had opened. It went that way through the evening. Claire leaned not on polish, but on curiosity. She asked about projects, about places they had traveled, about art pieces that caught her eye. When she didn't know a term, she admitted it, then listened. The candor disarmed people who were used to practice charm. All the while, Richard stayed close, a quiet presence at her side. His hand would find the curve of her back, steady and protective, guiding her through the maze of conversations. She saw him in a new light, less the calculating executive and more the man who wanted her to feel safe. At one point, her eyes lifted to a painting displayed near the grand staircase. It was a landscape she remembered from a school field trip years ago. The same brushstrokes she had once traced in a notebook margin. The recognition made her smile. Richard noticed. "Something familiar," he asked. "I saw this when I was 12, she said softly. "I didn't understand it then, but I remember thinking the colors felt alive." His gaze lingered on her a moment longer than necessary. "You still see what others miss," he murmured. The words warmed her more than the champagne she had barely touched. As the night unfolded, she and Richard began to move in unspoken rhythm. She could sense when he needed her to lean in with a question, when he wanted her to ease a pause with a small story. He, in turn, seemed to anticipate when she needed a breath, offering her water before she asked, steering her toward quieter corners when the crowd pressed too close. Guests responded to her sincerity with unexpected warmth. More than once, she caught approving glances, murmured comments about how refreshing it was to meet someone who wasn't rehearsed. Somewhere between conversation and laughter, between the music and the champagne bubbles, she felt herself relax. The fear that she would not belong began to fade. Instead, she felt present. It was during a pause between introductions, while they stood before a pair of impressionist paintings, that it happened. Richard's hand brushed hers, almost accidental, but neither pulled away. Their eyes met. It should have been part of the performance. A natural gesture for a man and his companion at a gala, but the air thickened, charged. His gaze held hers longer than courtesy required. Her breath hitched, and the room seemed to narrow until it was only the two of them, surrounded by brushstrokes and silence. For one suspended moment, the line between arrangement and truth blurred. The performance gathered heat that felt startlingly like reality. Claire's pulse thundered in her ears. She looked away first, pretending to admire the artwork, though her heart betrayed her calm. Richard cleared his throat gently. "Shall we get some air?" he asked, his voice quieter, almost tentative. She nodded, breath shallow, heart loud, the echo of that look still humming through her. Together, they turned toward the terrace doors, stepping away from chandeliers and champagne into the cool promise of the night beyond. City lights can pretend to be stars. On the museum's rooftop terrace, with Boston spread below in glitter and hum, Claire stepped into air that felt newly sharpened by autumn. The shawl wrapped around her shoulders caught a faint breeze, carrying the scent of stone, river, and the distant tang of the harbor. Richard followed, the door clicking softly behind them. For a moment, they stood side by side at the railing, watching headlights stream like silver ribbons along Commonwealth Avenue. The night hummed with the faint echo of the quartet inside, muffled by glass and walls. "It looks calmer from up here," Claire said, her voice low. Richard's hands rested on the cool iron railing. Appearances usually do. She turned her head, catching the lines of weariness at the edges of his profile. The gala had shown him polished, composed, commanding. But here, with the skyline reflecting in his eyes, something more human edged through. "You don't like these events," she said gently. He let out a quiet laugh, not bitter, but tired. "I can negotiate mergers that decide the future of hundreds of employees without blinking. Yet, walking into a ballroom full of opinions, that unsettles me." She considered this, surprised but not dismissive. "Because you can't control what they see." "Exactly." His gaze shifted toward her, steady but unguarded. "Veronica knows it too. She spreads her stories because she understands that doubt is harder to fight than data." Claire tightened the shawl at her throat. "I hate pretense," she admitted. "It's everywhere in those rooms. But I don't want fear to decide what I do. Not anymore." The words surprised her even as she spoke them, but they felt true, born from something deeper than conversation. Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, silence settled between them, silence that wasn't empty. It was full, holding questions, holding something neither had yet named. The city stretched outward, stars and lights tangled, as if the night itself leaned closer to listen. When he finally moved, It was with measured hesitation. His hand brushed against hers on the railing. The contact was light, tentative, almost accidental. She didn't pull away. Her heart pounded in her chest, steady but insistent. She lifted her eyes to his. His expression carried no command now, no calculation, only a question, quiet and raw. "Claire," he said softly. The sound of her name in his voice startled her more than the wind. She barely whispered, "Yes, may I?" His gaze flicked downward, then back, asking without forcing. Her throat tightened. For a moment, the world balanced on the edge of her answer. Then she nodded. The first kiss was tentative, testing, the kind of brush that could still be dismissed as nothing if either chose to retreat. But when she leaned into it, when her fingers caught lightly at the fabric of his sleeve, the kiss deepened. It was not performance, not the practice show of two people trying to sell a story. It was discovery. His hand rose to her cheek, steady and warm, anchoring her as the world tilted. She let the shawl slip slightly, the cool air forgotten against the heat of connection. For years, she had measured herself in competence, in invisibility, but under city lights disguised as stars, she felt seen not as efficient, not as steady, but as a woman who could be wanted. When they broke apart, their foreheads rested together, breaths uneven. Neither spoke at first. Words would have felt too fragile against what had just shifted between them. "Finally," Richard whispered. This was never part of the arrangement. "No," she murmured, her lips still close enough to feel the warmth of his. It wasn't. The truth hung there, undeniable. The boundary between what they pretended and what they had begun to feel was no longer clear. It might have gone further. Another kiss, another step closer to something neither had planned. But the terrace door opened with a faint creak. Claire turned her head quickly, pulling back just enough to steady her breath. Veronica Blake stepped into the light. Her gown shimmered, her hair catching the glow like a crown of fire. She didn't look surprised. She didn't even look curious. Her smile was sharp, the kind that cut without effort. "Well," Veronica said, her voice smooth as glass, "I see the stories write themselves." Richard straightened, his expression tightening into the mask she had seen in the boardroom. But the flicker in his eyes betrayed it. He knew how dangerous that look on Veronica's face could be. Claire felt her chest tighten. The warmth of the kiss was still alive on her lips, but already the air shifted, colder, sharper. The night had given her a glimpse of something real. Now she sensed a storm forming, waiting below the glitter and chandeliers. She wondered, as Veronica's gaze lingered with too much satisfaction, how truth would fare against a woman who thrived on doubt. A rumor doesn't need to be true. It only needs a room willing to listen. When Richard and Claire returned from the rooftop, the ballroom felt different. Nothing had shifted outwardly. The chandeliers still glowed, the quartet still played, the laughter still rose in polished waves. Yet the current in the room had changed, subtle but undeniable. Veronica Blake was moving through the crowd. She glided between circles of donors and executives as if she owned the air itself. Each group leaned closer when she spoke, then straightened with little smiles that spread too quickly. She didn't raise her voice, but her words moved like smoke curling, drifting, finding corners where doubt liked to settle. Claire recognized the pattern. It wasn't proof Veronica carried, only suggestion. Interesting, isn't it, how Richard suddenly appears with someone no one's heard? Of a secretary, I'm told. Doesn't it feel convenient? She didn't need to say more. The pause after convenient did the work. Cameras began to linger longer when they passed. Claire noticed the change, the way lenses followed with more hunger, as though waiting for a stumble that would confirm the story already whispered. At first, fear surged. The old kind, the one she had lived with during the slow collapse of her marriage. The fear of being misread, of having her truth twisted into something ugly. Her chest tightened, breath shallow, but Richard's hand pressed lightly at the small of her back, steady. He guided her through the crowd with calm precision, intercepting introductions before Veronica could. When she hesitated, He offered her water before she asked. When a group pressed too close, he shifted his stance just enough to shield her. It wasn't grand, and it wasn't loud, but it was care. And that care steadied her more than she expected. She studied Veronica from across the room. The woman's confidence was almost magnetic. Veronica didn't need evidence or allies. She carried certainty like perfume, and people breathed it in without question. Claire realized, with a clarity that surprised her, that the only power Veronica had was the willingness of others to believe her confidence. It wasn't facts, it was performance. If Claire tried to meet that with outrage, she would only feed the fire. But if she refused to flinch, if she chose calm, if she chose to stand as herself, that confidence might falter. So she did. She smiled when spoken to, asked questions with genuine interest, and let her sincerity carry the weight. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain. She was present, visible, steady, and slowly. She noticed the whispers shift, not vanish, but soften. Doubt is loud when met with panic. It is quieter when met with composure. Richard seemed to notice too. At one point, as they paused by a sculpture, he leaned close enough that only she could hear. "Thank you," he said simply. Her heart caught at the words. She didn't ask what for. She already knew. The night wound toward its end. The orchestra played slower pieces. Guests collected coats and kissed cheeks. Veronica lingered, her eyes following them with a satisfaction she didn't bother to hide. Claire didn't return the look. She didn't need to. When Richard escorted her back toward the waiting car, the cool September air met them like a truth too sharp to ignore. The gala had not collapsed, but the taste of warning lingered. Claire slipped into the seat, shawl tight around her shoulders. She glanced once more at the museum's glowing facade. She had walked into the night afraid of being invisible, then afraid of being misread. She had left with both fears alive, but also with something steadier inside her. Because she now understood, the story wouldn't end at the museum doors. Morning light is unforgiving when paired with headlines. Claire woke to the buzz of her phone on the nightstand. For a moment she thought it was her alarm, but the screen glowed with alerts, messages stacked one after another. Her heart sank before she touched the device. The first headline stared back in bold, hail hospitality CEO's new flame business strategy or paid companion. Her throat closed. The article came from a business blog known for its sharp edges. Photos filled the screen, grainy shots taken from the museum terrace. She saw herself in them, her shawl slipping as Richard bent close. One frame caught the kiss, blurred yet unmistakable. The text below quoted anonymous sources who claimed she had been hired to soften Richard's image. Words like arrangement, publicity stunt, and hired face cut deeper than the photographs. Claire lowered the phone to her lap, pressing her palms against her knees. For a moment, panic surged. Sharp and familiar, the same breathless fear she had carried during the unraveling of her marriage. When neighbors whispered and friends chose sides, she thought she had buried that woman. But here she was, staring at headlines. By the time she reached the office, the story had spread. Conversations quieted when she stepped into the elevator. Two associates near the copier lowered their voices, but not quickly enough. She caught fragments. Secretary, staged. Can you imagine? Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to stand tall, her portfolio balanced neatly in her arms. She moved through the hallways with steady steps, even as her skin burned with the heat of eyes on her. Text messages kept arriving. A college friend. "Are you okay?" Her mother, cautious. "Saw something online? Call me when you can." A former coworker, less gentle. "Guess you've moved up in the world." She wanted to curl inward, but beneath the panic was something new, a steadier voice. She was not powerless. She had walked into the gala on her own 2 feet, stood in front of strangers and been seen. That couldn't be erased by a rumor. Still, when Richard's assistant appeared at her desk with a quiet, "Mr. Hale wants you upstairs," her pulse spiked. The boardroom was already filled when she entered. Screens glowed with articles and social media posts. Lydia from PR spoke quickly about possible responses deflection, controlled statements, selective interviews. Tom, the CFO, warned of donor concerns, of partners already asking questions. Richard sat at the head of the table, silent. His eyes weren't on the screen, they were on Claire. She took a seat near the end, folding her hands in her lap. Finally. Richard spoke. His voice was calm, almost deceptively so. "No spin," he said. The room stilled. Lydia blinked. I mean transparency. We tell the truth. How this began, what it became. We stand in it. If people believe us, good. If they don't, at least we won't spend months tangled in false stories." A murmur rippled through the table. Tom frowned. "That's a risk." Richard's gaze didn't shift, so his pretending. Then he turned to Claire, and the whole room seemed to fade. "I won't speak for you," he said. "If you stand beside me, it has to be because you choose it, not because you feel cornered, not because of the company, because it's what you want." Her heart lurched. He could have made it an order, another line in her job description. Instead, he had handed her the choice. She swallowed, unable to answer in front of so many eyes. He seemed to understand. He didn't press. The meeting moved on, voices weighing costs and optics. But Claire barely heard them. Her mind spun with a different question. What kind of woman was she that night? She sat at her small kitchen table. The chipped mug beside her steamed with tea. Bills were stacked in neat rows. The midnight blue gown hung behind her bedroom door, silent witness to choices she hadn't expected to make. She looked at her hands, folded around the warm ceramic. They were capable hands, steady hands. For years they had served others, keeping schedules, smoothing paths. But tonight, she wondered if they could hold something more, something as fragile and dangerous as truth. The clock ticked softly. Outside, the city moved as always, traffic lights changing, trains groaning, people crossing streets with their heads down. Inside, Claire breathed, long and slow. She knew the decision waiting, she knew the risk, and she knew the pull in her chest, the one that whispered she was tired of living small. She lifted the mug, took a slow sip, and set it down with care. Then she straightened, shoulders square. She was ready to answer. When the world points a finger, the question isn't what they see, it's what you stand on. By Tuesday morning, Claire could feel the weight of the headlines pressing into her skin. In the elevator, colleagues pretended to scroll their phones but stole glances. In the break room, two assistants lowered their voices mid-laugh when she entered, leaving behind the residue of suspicion. Even a kind smile from Lydia in PR felt tinged with pity. By noon, Claire had packed her bag twice in her mind. Quitting would be simple, a quiet resignation, a return to invisibility. It would protect her from stares, shield the company from further scandal, and release Richard from the burden of defending her. But each time she imagined the scene, she felt hollow. Walking away might save face, but it would also erase her voice, and she was tired of erasing herself. That afternoon, Richard appeared at her desk. No entourage, no assistant, just him. His voice was low, measured, "Walk with me." They crossed the lobby, out onto the sidewalk where September air carried the faint scent of roasted chestnuts from a vendor. Richard led her toward the Charles River, the two of them walking in silence until the hum of the city softened. Finally, he spoke. "You think leaving would solve this?" Claire didn't deny it. "The story would fade if I weren't here." He stopped near the railing, looking out over the water. The late sun painted ripples in gold. "Claire, do you know when I first noticed you?" She shook her head, uncertain. 3 months ago, elevator stuck between floors, everyone restless. You kept people calm without raising your voice. You asked me how my day was not Mr. Hale's day, not the CEO's, just mine. No one does that. He turned to face her, his expression steady but softer than she'd ever seen. I started watching after that. Meetings, hallways. You had this way of steadying rooms without asking for credit. I noticed long before the gala. Her throat tightened. These weren't the words of strategy. There was a tremor beneath them, one that sounded dangerously like care. Richard, she paused, choosing carefully. You're asking me to stand in something I never wanted, to be seen in ways I don't know how to manage. I know, he said, and I won't ask it unless you choose it. But I believe you can, and I believe we'll weather it better together than apart. The river shimmered between them. Quiet witness. Claire looked down at her hands on the railing. For years, they had carried files, typed reports, organized lives that weren't hers. And now they shook with the weight of a choice that was. I can't be part of a storyline without a voice, she said finally. The words came out firm, surprising even her. If we go forward, I won't be silent. I won't be just a name in your defense. I need to speak too. Richard's eyes met hers, unwavering. Then you will. Your agency is non-negotiable. If we do this, it's because we both choose it. The ground beneath her seemed to shift, not with fear but with steadiness. For the first time since the scandal broke, she felt a path beneath her feet. Not easy, not safe, but real. They stood in silence for a while, the river carrying fragments of sunlight past them. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed, chasing pigeons along the walkway. Life moved on, ordinary and unbothered, even as her own tilted. When the sun lowered toward the horizon, Richard spoke again. We'll hold a press conference tomorrow, clear, honest, without spin. We'll set the time tonight. Claire nodded slowly. Fear and peace sat down together inside her. Two guests at the same table. She didn't know which would linger longer, but she felt ready to host them both. That evening, she sat by her apartment window, the chipped mug of tea warm in her hands. Across the Charles, dusk gathered in violet layers. Street lamps blinked awake. She thought of the crowd she would face, of cameras, of questions sharp enough to cut. Her stomach tightened, but beneath the fear pulsed something steadier, a refusal to be erased. She lifted the mug, sipped slowly, and whispered into the quiet, I'll stand. Truth costs what it costs. Sometimes, it buys more than it takes. The conference room looked ordinary by corporate standards, neutral walls, a podium, rows of folding chairs, but today it held more eyes than Claire had ever imagined facing. Reporters filled the seats, cameras stacked along the back, microphones angled forward like a forest of questions waiting to be voiced. Claire stood behind the curtain with Richard. His suit was simple, his tie dark, nothing meant to dazzle. The backdrop behind the podium bore only the company's logo, plain against white. No theatrics, no attempt at distraction. Her hands trembled, but Richard's voice steadied the air between them. Remember, no spin, he murmured, just truth. She nodded, drawing a breath deep enough to reach her ribs. When they stepped onto the stage together, flashes erupted. The sound of cameras clicking was a storm in itself. Richard moved first to the microphone, his posture straight but not rigid. Good afternoon, he began. His voice carried authority, but softer than in boardrooms. Many of you have questions about my personal life. I intend to answer them plainly. He didn't rush. Each word fell measured, deliberate. It is true that I asked Claire Bennett to accompany me to the Museum of Fine Arts Gala as part of a professional strategy. Rumors had been circulated questioning my ability to form meaningful relationships. I believed appearing with someone I trusted would counter that narrative. The room shifted, pens scratching, cameras whirring. What I did not expect, he continued, was that what began as arrangement would reveal something genuine. Claire is not a strategy. She is not a hired face. She is a woman I admire deeply. And whatever grows from here will not be defined by rumor, but by the truth we live. He stepped back, and for a moment Claire feared the silence. Then he turned toward her with a nod. The microphone waited, her pulse thundered, but she walked forward anyway. My name is Claire Bennett, she said, her voice clear, though softer than his. I am an executive secretary at Hale Hospitality. I earned that role through education, persistence, and years of work. I was not hired to pretend, nor to perform. I was asked to stand beside Richard at one event. I agreed, with boundaries. What has grown since belongs to us, not to a headline. She paused, scanning the room. Faces stared back skeptical, curious, hungry. I understand how this looks, but appearances are not always truth. Sincerity is quieter, harder to measure, but it is real. That is what I bring, and that is what I refuse to hide. Questions began almost immediately. Ms. Bennett, isn't it convenient that your relationship began just before a merger? Claire let the words hang a moment before answering. Convenience doesn't keep conversations going at midnight. Convenience doesn't notice when someone skips lunch 3 days in a row, or that they take their coffee black because they're too busy to stop for cream. Connection does. A flicker ran through the room. Not applause, not agreement, but a shift, reporters leaning in, pens slowing, as though they hadn't expected detail to cut so cleanly. Another question followed, sharper. Mr. Hale, how can shareholders trust your judgment when personal choices blur into business? Richard's response was steady. Shareholders have always trusted me to act with integrity. That does not stop at the office door. Choosing transparency here is not distraction. It is consistency. They faced more questions angled to provoke, to expose cracks. But neither raised defenses. They chose steadiness. Claire answered simply when addressed, no embellishment, no apology. Richard kept his tone calm, his words plain. The conference lasted less than an hour, though it felt longer. When the final question fell away, Richard thanked the press for their time. Together, they stepped from the stage, flashes still sparking as they disappeared behind the curtain. Instead of returning through the crowded lobby, they followed a staff member down a service corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, footsteps echoing on plain tile. It was a stark contrast to the storm of cameras. And in that quiet, Claire felt her shoulders loosen. Richard walked beside her, their steps in sync. At one point, their shoulders brushed, a small contact that felt heavier than applause. They weren't triumphant, they weren't even safe. The public would decide later, turning over their words in headlines and broadcasts. But as they walked down that corridor, Claire felt something undeniable. They had stood in the light not as rumor, not as spin, but as themselves, and that was already enough. After the speech comes the quiet where consequences settle. That is where love proves its weight. The press conference faded into the news cycle within hours, but its ripples spread wide. Some outlets carried headlines thick with skepticism, too convenient, too clean. Others struck warmer notes, authenticity in an age of spin. A few even turned thoughtful, publishing long essays about transparency in leadership and the cost of privacy for those in public view. Claire read none of them in full. She skimmed just enough to know the tone, then set her phone face down. Too much attention made her chest feel tight. What mattered wasn't the headlines, it was how she lived the hours in between. For Richard, the aftermath was more complicated. Partners recalibrated their stance. One international investor postponed negotiations indefinitely, wary of distraction. But another long-standing donor doubled their commitment, citing respect for his candor. A hotel developer in Chicago, previously hesitant, called to say, "If you can weather that storm, you can weather ours." The balance sheet shifted, but not disastrously. Business bent, but did not break. Veronica, meanwhile, continued her campaign. She granted interviews, insisting Richard's press conference had been another layer of performance, but her voice no longer carried the same force. Too many had noticed her pattern, the timing of her whispers, the convenient coincidences. Doubt clung to her now, brittle at the edges. Inside the company, life pressed forward. Meetings resumed, projects moved, deadlines loomed. Yet something subtle had changed. Where once Claire walked unnoticed, she now met steady eyes, some respectful, some curious, some cautious. She answered each with calm, refusing to shrink. Her evenings grew different too. Richard made time where none had existed before. They walked along the harbor after long days, pausing to watch ferries cross the water. They tried a small Italian place in the North End, where Claire teased him for ordering plain spaghetti when the menu held richer choices. Sundays became dinners cooked in her apartment kitchen, her lasagna slightly uneven, his salad too heavy on olives. They laughed through the mishaps, learning each other's habits not as roles, but as people. It was in these small rituals that trust deepened, not in speeches, not in public stands, but in the way he carried grocery bags without being asked, or the way she left notes on his desk reminding him to breathe between meetings. Ordinary moments became anchors, heavier than noise, yet whispers still brushed against her name. Some employees wondered aloud if her closeness meant favoritism. Some outsiders doubted her credentials. Claire felt the sting each time, but she learned to meet it with patience. Then came the review. Every promotion at Hale Hospitality required a clear audit, measurable merit, documented contributions, board approval. Claire's work had always been steady, often invisible. But when the review committee pulled the files, the record spoke. Campaigns she had organized, partnerships she had supported, efficiencies she had implemented quietly over years, all lined up in black and white. The decision came in early spring. Claire Bennett was named Director of Communications and Marketing. The announcement stressed her measurable achievements, her record of discretion, her role in stabilizing public image during crisis. The whispers lost oxygen. Transparency had undercut them. On the morning of the announcement, Claire stood at her window with coffee in hand, watching the last patches of snow retreat from the sidewalks. The city looked softer, edges blurred by sunlight that promised warmth. She thought of the chipped mug that had once felt like the weight of her life. Now it felt like part of a larger table being set. That evening, Richard arrived at her apartment carrying a bouquet of tulips, awkwardly wrapped in brown paper. "Not roses," he said. "Those felt too expected." She laughed, sliding them into a vase. "Tulips are perfect." They ate dinner at her small table, tulips between them, city sounds drifting through the open window. Conversation turned not to headlines or strategies, but to summer plans, trips they might take, recipes they wanted to try, books half finished. When she leaned back in her chair, watching dusk gather, she realized possibility no longer felt like risk. It felt like home, a home they were furnishing together, piece by piece. Outside, spring edged into Boston. Inside, two people who had once been strangers now carried the quiet certainty of something worth weathering. Some places hold a door to the life you almost didn't choose. Returning there, you honor the courage it took to open it. 6 months had passed since the press conference. 6 months since Claire stood at a microphone and chose visibility over retreat. In that time, her life had stretched wider than she could have imagined. She now carried the title of Director of Communications, her office bright with new responsibilities and the steady hum of a team that looked to her for clarity. The promotion had not been gift or gesture. It came on the back of documented achievements, audits, and approval votes that left no room for whispers. She had earned it. Each time she signed a memo with her new title, she felt both gratitude and gravity. Richard's world had shifted too. Some partnerships had fallen away, others had flourished. What remained was leaner, but stronger. His leadership bore a new edge of humanity, and though a few still doubted, many more respected the steadiness that had carried him through scandal without collapse. Their life together had taken quieter shape. Claire kept her apartment, though Richard's townhouse often held her books and sweaters now. They found rhythm in morning coffees, in shared calendars, in evenings where business and tenderness mingled without conflict. And now, in early spring, they returned to the Museum of Fine Arts. The event was smaller this time, a gathering of donors and local patrons. No chandeliers blazing, no cameras flashing, just the soft murmur of conversation in marble halls, the sound of shoes on polished floors. Claire walked beside Richard, her hand resting lightly against his arm, and felt the strange echo of that first night, the performance, the nerves, the weight of eyes. But tonight the weight was gone. What remained was memory, and the quiet pride of return. At some point, Richard steered her away from the crowd. They slipped into a side gallery where impressionist canvases lined the walls. The room was dimly lit, hushed, the kind of space where time seemed to slow. Claire paused before a painting she remembered from childhood, a cluster of lilies painted with loose, tender strokes. She recalled seeing it on a field trip, pressing close to the glass while her classmates giggled elsewhere. Back then, she had felt small and unseen, a girl who memorized colors instead of names. Richard's voice drew her back. "Do you remember standing here with me that first night?" She turned. He was watching her. Eyes softened in a way she knew few others ever saw. "I do," she said. "We stood too close, and I couldn't tell what was real." And now, his voice was quiet, but it carried. She smiled faintly. "Now, I can." For a moment, silence stretched. Then Richard reached into his pocket and drew out a small box. Not velvet, not grand, just a simple leather case, worn at the edges. He opened it to reveal a ring, a single stone set in a band of gold. Not flashy, not staged. "Claire," he said, steady but low. "The first time I asked you for something, it was an arrangement, a part to play. Tonight I'm asking again, but the terms are different. Not performance, not strategy, just belonging. Will you choose this with me? Not for appearance, but for life." The air seemed to hold its breath. Claire felt the press of all her old fears, the habit of invisibility, the sting of judgment, but they no longer ruled her. What filled her instead was the memory of Sunday dinners, of laughter over burned garlic bread, of mornings where trust was built one ordinary cup of coffee at a time. Her throat tightened, but her voice came clear. "Yes, I choose this. I choose you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand steady against hers. No applause rose, no cameras flared, just the hush of a gallery, the watch of painted lilies, the quiet start of a new chapter. They stood for a long moment, close but unhurried, letting the weight of the choice settle. Not triumphant, not staged, simply aligned. Later, as they left the museum together, Claire glanced back once. The marble steps glowed under soft lights. She thought of the first time she had climbed them, nerves trembling, heart uncertain. She thought of the woman who had steadied her breath outside the top-floor office door, hand on the handle, wondering why a man like Richard Hale would ever need a woman like her. Now she knew. The story ended where it began, and began where it ended, two people stepping into a future they would keep honest, one ordinary day at a time. What this story reminds us is that love and dignity are built not in grand gestures, but in the steady courage to be seen as we are. Claire spent years hiding behind routines, believing invisibility was the safest path. Richard, though powerful, feared that appearances defined his worth. Both discovered that pretense can only carry us so far. The turning point was not the gala, the scandal, or even the press conference. It was the choice to tell the truth, even when the truth was fragile. It was the quiet insistence that no one deserves to be a silent character in their own story. For those of us who have lived through decades of change, the lesson is simple but enduring: never underestimate the strength of honesty, the power of small daily rituals, and the gift of choosing love with open eyes. We cannot control how others judge us, but we can decide how we stand with steadiness, with grace, and with the willingness to risk connection. Life is shorter than we think, and safer paths are not always fuller ones. Sometimes the braver choice is the truer one, and that makes all the difference. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story. We hope it touched your heart and gave you something to reflect on. If you enjoyed it, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep bringing you more heartfelt stories that inspire, heal, and remind us of what truly matters.